Yes. So Billy Fleming is the director, the Wilkes family director at Ian McGrath Center, and which is located in the Weizmann School of Design, and is a senior fellow with Data for Progress. His fellowship with Data for Progress has focused on the built environment impacts on climate change, and resulted most prominently in the publication of low carbon public housing policies briefs tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, which was introduced in 2019. In his role at the McGrath Center, Billy is co-editor of the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, and co-editor and co-curator of the book, and now internationally traveling exhibition Design with Nature Now. He's also an author of the forthcoming Drown in America, The Nature and Politics of Adaptation. Billy is also the lead author of the recently published and widely acclaimed the 2100 project, An Atlas for a Green New Deal, and also author of the Indivisible Guide. Prior to joining Penn, he worked as a landscape architect, city planner, organizer, and later in the Obama administration's White House Domestic Policy Council. And he holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Arkansas, a Master of Community and Regional Planning from the University of Texas, and a Doctorate of City and Regional Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. So we should be welcoming him as soon as he joins the call.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And thanks for being patient with me being a little late here. Especially, I know you all are just coming off of lunch, so probably like a little tired already. So hello, and thanks again. My name's Billy. Really looking forward to chatting about some of the work we've done around the Green New Deal with you today. And so I'm going to just jump right into it. And for me, it's always kind of easiest to begin with just kind of refresher on what we mean when we say Green New Deal, at least what I mean when I say Green New Deal. And that often requires kind of starting at House Resolution 109. I'm sure this is a doc you all are quite familiar with now, but just as a way to kind of refresh you, if you go through HR 109, among the many things it calls for in the framework it lays out for kind of a 10-year plus mobilization around jobs, justice, and decarbonization are these very built environment specific elements. So it treats here, the building resiliency against climate disasters, the realignment of federal industrial policy around clean manufacturing, the retrofitting of every existing building for max water and energy efficiency, the remediation of every hazmat or toxic site in the US, treats all of these as kind of critical sites of investment through something like the Green New Deal. All of which are pretty obviously kind of squarely in the wheelhouse of architects, landscape architects, and sort of built environment professionals generally. And so often get asked, too, I always like to kind of preempt this question, though I'm happy to chat about it. Often get asked, what's unique among, or why focus on the Green New Deal and not on other kind of climate forward plans? And the answer, at least for me, is that it's quite unique, at least amongst climate plans in the US. And that it's the only one that really attempts to fuse the really technocratic or technical aims of the climate world around decarbonization with demands for jobs and for justice from blue-collar workers and frontline communities. Often here in the US, we get one or the other, but not, or we get one or two of these, but not all three. My cat is in the background here. And so it also is important to really understand the context in which the Green New Deal is kind of emerging. So obviously not in a vacuum, always imagined as kind of a crisis package or a stimulus package, and very much kind of in response to some of the perceived failures of the last period like this in the US and really around the world, the Great Recession, 2007 to 9, and this book from one of Barack Obama's kind of inner circle economic advisors is one of the best kind of autopsies at that moment that's put forward. I won't spend a ton of time on it because it's a book that deserves kind of full attention, but I'll say the kind of takeaway from it are that the 2009 Obama stimulus, ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, was a failure in the US for a variety of reasons. The most important of it being it was too small. so 831 billion, which obviously I think today seems kind of laughable relative to what's been spent on all manner of COVID recovery and relief packages. It was far too targeted towards Wall Street and big business. One of the ways I think that's also been proven true these last few months has been, we were told pretty pointedly by the Obama administration that it was too technically hard to figure out how to do mortgage and rent moratoria during the Great Recession. And obviously we figured out how to do that, at least in the US, over the last couple of months or years. And the third being, it was a one-time funding bill. There was something called automatic stabilizers attached. And I won't spend a ton of time on that, just to say, when you hear automatic stabilizers thrown around as a part of ongoing stimulus or recovery discussions, it's often because it's widely recognized now that the lack of those in the 08-09 packages was quite a problem. And I'll say, back more than 10 years ago now, Nancy Levinson, among other people, was really, I think, already sort of writing about this nascent failure that was coming forward from the Obama stimulus package. Writing here that it seems increasingly clear that the Great Recession is not sparking a New Deal. Instead, we confront our crisis in a political climate that's contemptuous to the very idea of the public. And I always like to begin to pull us into the New Deal a bit more. I think it's quite important for us to spend some time on the New Deal, given that that's the central reference chosen by Green New Dealers. And when I do that, I always like to kind of begin with this weird slide, which has probably some familiar imagery to you on it. The national park posters, some of the more familiar kind of ag posters. Then this really bizarre public health dinosaur and syphilis poster. Can't explain it. I'll just say there's a lovely book, Posters for the People, that has basically as big a collection of these posters as exists in the world. And there's an entire series of just those. So to pull us into the New Deal, again, I think this is a part where there's a really obvious connection to the Green New Deal that often gets overlooked. And it's in the way that the two are mythologized. And so here, again, from Nancy, she's saying that the New Deal is best understood not as an overarching plan, but as a series of improvisations held together, not by theory, but by strategy. And here what she really means, one is that, FDR and his advisors didn't walk in with a checklist that they were just kind of ticking off as, the days went by in his first term. They were experimenting. This was a moment of sort of profound public sector experimentation with a very underdeveloped state and a bunch of things that were put into action by him and by FDR and his team that were very short-lived because they either didn't work or the board struck them down. And what you found at the end of the New Deal was kind of a contemporary or modern state of the U.S. as we know it today, one that didn't exist when they began. The other sort of myth that often gets associated with the New Deal is that it was a very sort of top-down, heavy-handed, tightly controlled, set of ideas or set of policies, and it wasn't. At its kind of simplest, the New Deal was a massive federal transfer of funds to state and local government who implemented things as they saw fit. And we'll talk about that in a bit, just a little more detail. The other thing I would say too about the New Deal at kind of a high level is that it's made possible by a series of overlapping crises. One being the Great Depression, and really that being the last time that in the U.S. we had unemployment levels where they are now of around 25%. So this is kind of our own economic crisis of the 1930s. They had the Dust Bowl, their own ecological crisis of the 1930s, and the forced migration of about 3.5 million people from the Great Plains to out west as agriculture collapsed in the Midwest. And then the third being our own kind of political crisis, or the rise of global fascism. And those things kind of coming to a head at the same time in the same places are really what makes the New Deal possible. And if we think about the Green New Deal as kind of a stimulus or a crisis designed package, we have to think about what those crises might be for us too. And again, on the New Deal, at least in my, the beginning of this work on my end, thought of it as quite as a set of ideas built around a couple of universal programs, mostly Social Security, and then a few large, but major infrastructure projects, which it certainly had. But I think the other thing that often gets sort of submerged about the New Deal is that it was just a massive built environment investment program. And over the course of the New Deal in the U.S., around 55,000 or so local, built environment, natural environment projects are built and funded. About 15,000 of them are shown here. And they include things that are probably quite familiar, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Appalachian Regional Trail, Grand Coulee Dam, but also just endless amounts of the kinds of projects that were hugely important to the development of cities in the U.S. And are not the kinds of things that generate magazine covers. So sanitary sewer systems, public schools, public libraries, public housing, state and local park systems. You go down the list of kind of civic and public infrastructure, and the New Deal built some piece of it on almost every part of the country. And just to look in really quickly, I was zooming into Seattle last week to talk about this. So have their kind of their campus within the New Deal up on here. And so this is pretty typical. Most land grant or public unis in the U.S. have at least some vestige of the New Deal on its campus, including here in their case, the university post office, the entire building as opposed to just the artwork, which is usually the norm. And then also a piece of their football stadium built by the WPA during the New Deal. And I wanted to zoom in on some of these projects just because I think we often get kind of stuck in conversations about the Tennessee Valley Authority when we talk about the New Deal. And in my mind, the TVA presents a lot of problems. But to just focus on maybe why it's become such a central part of the discourse in landscape architecture and architecture. One of the most obvious reasons is that it was run by landscape architects and architects in the 1930s, and there's really nothing we like more than self-mythology, I think, in the design world. And to be fair, also as a result of it being run by architects and landscape architects, the infrastructure itself is sort of the epitome of the technological sublime. It's beautiful, and this is the Norris Dam under construction in Tennessee here. Like the rest of the TVA system, is designed to be both, obviously to provide hydroelectric power, but also to be a spectacle, to be a thing that people would, drive across the country to go see. And in fact, they did. In the post-war suburban boom, the Tennessee Valley system becomes the second most visited public land system in the U.S. after the National Mall and its kind of associated lands. Also, of course, becomes a major jobs engine in the region. You can see here folks going off the line at a shift change, but again, because the New Deal was because the New Deal was effectively a mass transfer of funds from federal government to state and local government, it didn't carry with it any real sort of idea or theory of power. So what I mean by that is that the New Deal funds were basically used to prop up whatever power structure existed on the ground where they were spent. And so in the TVA's case, that meant that building a bunch of beautiful, sublime infrastructure carried with it a pretty heavy cost that was aligning themselves with Jim Crow, politicians and their supporters in the South. And so in the TVA, pulling from Rent Sequel here, despite Black residents constituting over 7% of the population around Norris, they made up just 2% of the workers who qualified for TVA jobs. And electrification promised significant improvements in standards of living for some rural Americans, but the inequities of Jim Crow were left largely untouched. We'll talk about that a bit more here in just a second. And in more contemporary conversations, those of you who follow Green New Deal, discourse as tightly as I do, which no one should, but if you do, you probably already know this. Electric company. There's a very live debate about the role of ownership in the power or electrical system, and I think no more acutely so than after all that's gone on in Texas over the last 10 days or so, and whether utility systems and utilities themselves should be governed by the people or by private companies. And I bring that up because the TVA is often weaponized in those discussions as an example of what goes wrong when public power is instituted, because the TVA has a very dirty fuel mix. it's pointed to as by opponents of public power as the result of what happens when you put the public sector in charge of things. It's a pretty disingenuous argument that after about 3 seconds of understanding the political economy of the Tennessee Valley fades away. It's a place, built entirely on the fossil fuel system, and you have to be appointed by a statewide elected official in the Tennessee Valley to wind up on the TVA's governing board. So it's basically impossible to do without a pretty deep connection to the coal and natural gas industry. But needless to say, I think, again, the focus on the TVA has really, I think, upended some of the more powerful arguments around certainly the energy system in the Green New Deal. And that's a shame because actually, at least on the landscape architecture side, when you think about like what are the other places that, designers worked in the New Deal that we might begin to take some inspiration from, they were scattered across the full breadth of the alphabet agencies put forward by FDR. So obviously the TVA, but many, many other places, some of which still exist today. One of those places that, was among the most successful, especially within the electricity or energy system, was the Rural Electrification Administration, which to me is a much better place to start than the TVA when we think about, how we might take it, an historical model, and attune it to the sort of crises and realities of today. So the REA itself, it exists in the first year of the New Deal as intended to be only a bank, so a way to fund private utilities building out the rural electric infrastructure of the U.S. And after about 18 months or so of negotiations in which the utility bosses kept coming back to FDR with plans that were 3, 4, or 5 times what he wanted to spend or he thought he needed to spend on the infrastructure, and still weren't getting anywhere near the 90% or so electrification rates he demanded. In year 2 of his first term, he said, "To hell with private utilities, I'm going to do all of this myself," and fully funded the REA. And fully funded to him meant about $18 billion or so a year for 10 years in adjusted dollars, so $180 billion over the course of the New Deal to build out the rural electric infrastructure of the U.S. And there's lots more than is on this map, but on this map, you're seeing 380,000 miles of transmission line. That's about 40% of all the line ever built in the history of the U.S., built during this period by REA folks. And you see about 700 or so rural electric co-ops. So these are, basically publicly owned, publicly run utilities, staffed, or at least their boards filled with teachers, nurses, farmers, other folks sort of living in the catchment area of the co-op. All of these made possible. So this distributed small d democratic power system, which, being built by the REA to me seems like a much more interesting place to begin thinking about what the Green New Deal might make possible again. And so here again, to pull from Brent a few more time, or one more time for now, a few more times later, he's making a version of this argument as well. And it's really great essay on the TVA that, the TVA comprised an expanse of about, 40,000 or so square miles, the size of England. Meanwhile, the REA offered a national program of finance and eventually operated in 46 states. And, you can see there's lots more to say about the REA TVA thing that we'll come back to in just a moment, but we can see, versions of this alternative to the TVA as like an historical argument in other places, including the Civil Aeronautics Authority. So this is the predecessor to the FAA. Among many other things, they build they spend $1 trillion in adjusted funds over the course of the New Deal, building out the municipal airport system of the U.S. So won't go through all of the airports, but there are several that we still use today, including Chicago Midway, several that have been decommissioned and turned into infill housing, like Stapleton in Denver or Mueller in Austin. But what you get with this system, in addition to the physical airports themselves, are these really, strange navigation devices, including beacons on the ground and arrows that Chris Forsyth here in a recent Places Journal article has been documenting, which still, for the most part, exists. You had arrows there so that you could literally look out the side of your plane and see that you were going in the right direction for radar airports. And here's Chicago Midway. If you've flown through Chicago, probably have maybe not used it, but at least seen it. And then LaGuardia as well in New York, being built initially by the New Deal. And so to begin to move us towards the end of the New Deal and into the Green New Deal, I'm going to pull from Brent pretty heavily for a moment and just say, beneath the cheery language of partnership that often embedded in the New Deal often lay a bitter truth that the prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities. The New Deal's politics of partnership changed local interest group politics, elevating the power of some and diminishing that of others. And it allowed political modes typically thought of as quite antithetical, like urban liberalism or even socialism and Sunbelt conservatism, to each take root through the partnerships within the New Deal state. And the New Deal's politics of partnership enabled local authorities to enjoy the benefits of federal spending while obscuring the national government's authority. And there's lots there we could dissect, and there's a really fantastic book Brett and his colleagues have put together called "Shaped by the State: Towards New Political History of the 20th Century." That's quite U.S. focused, but does a bit of comparative politics between the U.S. and Europe and the European Union that I would 100% recommend everyone pick up. And to think about this stuff in a more contemporary context, I've been relying a bit, in recent months on some of Keller's writing in this book, Extra Statecraft. And I'll just, again, pull from her pretty directly before jumping into some Green New Deal work that's underway in the center. So Keller here, in an interview about Extra Statecraft is saying that in the context of the kind of infrastructure space that I'm looking at, all the stuff that's repeated from spatial products to whole cities might be especially empowering. It might be harder to make a meaningful object form alone, but easier to make an active form that can piggyback on those to recondition spaces in a politically significant way. And rather than asking architecture to be more interdisciplinary, suggesting other disciplines might exploit the powers of architecture and urbanism as spatial variables are underexplored in governance. And the reason I think Keller's work in Extra Statecraft in particular is of importance now is to think about the codes or active forms that she puts forward in that book as sort of some of the products of the legacies of the New Deal, the various ways in which it bound local officials to the public works and infrastructure making business in the US, which is quite a business and did not exist in any way, shape, or form as we know it today before the New Deal. It was part of the state building activity of the New Deal. And also because the Green New Deal itself is going to require the same level of kind of mass investment in buildings, landscapes, infrastructure, public works, and will require the same kind of thinking about how that gets systematized. And so I'll come back to that in just a second, but I'll say, the genesis, I think, for this talk is like most other talks, was probably this essay from a couple of years ago, almost a couple of years ago now, called Design of the Green New Deal, which, I won't go through the whole thing. I'll just say, it was quickly built around a couple of really key questions. One of those being, can a set of practices tied to luxury real estate deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by climate change and inequality? Or put another way, can designers be both instruments of either neoliberalism or capitalism and activist forces in the fight for climate justice? If you read that essay, the answer to that in my mind is pretty obviously no. And so the question we've been wrestling with, or I've been wrestling with in some of the work in the center the last few years has been, what do we do with that? I think one of the profound luxuries of being at a place like Penn, or being really at any university, is that you have the ability, if you want it, to operate outside of market forces. So aren't constrained by the same forces that that require firms and other private enterprises to operate the way that they do. And so for me, that's meant sort of pursue like probing in four different directions, thinking about ways we might approach the Green New Deal alternatively through the luxury, again, that academia provides us. One has been on this tool building side. So in the top left, thinking about how to develop public tools for both educational and sort of public imagination purposes. How do we help people see, the Green New Deal and the climate crisis where they live and how they live? In the top right, through some of the creative work going on in studios here, how do we think about, building up the images and stories of the future world that a Green New Deal might build? And in some ways, how do we make ourselves useful to the climate justice movement through studios is really the question, I think, in that body of work. In the bottom left here, this data for progress report, this has been an interdisciplinary group of folks who all have some form of climate and built environment sort of policy expertise, thinking through the different aspects of the built environment and how we might treat some of them as sort of strategic sites in the earlier first phase kind of rollout of something like a Green New Deal. And so in that case, beginning with public housing. And then the fourth has been, thinking through, at least for me, having some ability to use the McCarty Center Repentance platform and its resources to create space for different kinds of conversations to happen through our programming. So in this case, this event from about a year and a half ago, but I'll talk some more about that in just a second. So on the tool building side, this is probably familiar, or at least to some of you. This is an atlas for the Green New Deal. So this is a project that began in 2017, was published towards the end of 2019, and it's really about addressing a couple of things. One is just that, the majority of the kind of critical climate and spatialized climate built environment data that you might need in order to think about either the consequences or the possibilities of a Green New Deal in your community it's almost all paywall. So some of this is publicly available, but at the scale of your community, it's often hard to find in the US. It's sort of sequestered behind academic paywalls and other kinds of gatekeeping devices. And then the other is that, to the extent that these things do exist, they're often quite hard to use. They're, the kind of national or global maps coming out of nature or science, which I think for a technical audience are fantastic, and for almost anyone else, they're kind of impenetrable. And so this atlas was about, trying to curate and collect as much of that data, as much of those data as we could, and put it into something that was compelling and charismatic enough that someone would want to spend, an hour scrolling through maps, which is a pretty big ask in all times, but especially now when everyone spends every moment of their day zipping around the internet or on Zoom. And I'll get this to go on for just a second. There we go. And so among the many things that came out of this were really the first, this is project, among the many things it includes is the first visualization of Matt Hauer's work on climate migration. And so Matt's a geographer at Florida State. His work is really focused on trying to literally count up how many structures will go underwater by at the end of the century due to sea level rise, and now appending those figures to different demographic models to get a sense of where they're likely to move without any real sort of policy interventions. And so obviously thinking through questions of kind of managed retreat or climate migration in the US is going to become ever increasingly important. And Matt is really the first person to begin spatializing some of those questions. So this is the first attempt really at visualizing some of them. We're also now kind of, so that domestic atlas, obviously is up and live and honestly very heavily used. It's the most used part of the McCarty Center site. We're now finishing up this spring, possibly into the summer, the kind of what we're calling a field guide toward an internationalist Green New Deal. And rather than choosing an atlas, which I think implies some level of objectivity or implies some level of completeness, we're treating this more as kind of a loose framework to be filled out over time, of which we'll kind of be the ones to create the first installment, and is looking at all the different topic areas that are of some relevance to the global energy transition that a Green New Deal requires. So you're looking here at a quick mock-up of some of the six extinction work or mapping we've been doing, looking here at some of the analysis of borders and trade that we've been doing, so getting a sense of what is owned by a particular trading bloc or country versus what is considered sort of open or public in terms of waterways and freight travel. I've also been thinking with some of the students involved in this about, again, alternative ways of communicating some of this really dense information. So in addition to mapping kind of global supply matrices and chains around rare earth minerals, they've been creating these really lovely collectible or trading cards, or you can even think about them as kind of flashcards to teach people about rare earth minerals that come with this set. So that's on the tool building side. On the sort of platform side, I won't say a ton about this because the video is out there in the world and it's very long. If you really want to watch it, spend 10 hours kind of listening to or watching a video. I'm happy to drop the link to it, but about 18 months or so ago, along with my friend Daniel and Donna Cohen here, hosted this event, Designing a Green New Deal, which was really about taking some of the sort of national and international, folks who've been leading the conversation around the Green New Deal, and to put them into conversation with planners and designers to begin asking, questions about what this might actually look like, how it might be implemented, what are the things we could be doing to better align our efforts with theirs, et cetera. And I won't go through, the full roster. You can see everybody there. You can see the folks on stage, but I'll say, this is Varshini Prakash from the Sunrise Movement, kind of introducing the event for us that day or that evening, or the last panel that evening, excuse me. And I always like to show this photo for a couple of reasons. One is that, this event was kicked off by our provost, Wendell Pritchett, who's lovely, and his work has been, I think actually hugely important to the way I think about cities. But he opened it with, I think, what he didn't realize was a joke, but turned out to be, and said, even he was really excited to see this room so filled up for this conversation. He'd never seen it this full before, not even for our former, at the time current, but former faculty member and now President Joe Biden. And so felt, really good about being able to pack a room like this for a conversation like the one we had. And the other reason I like it is because if you know corporate architecture very well, this is just kind of an insane picture, because you have the US DSA Eco-Socialist Caucus next to Naomi Klein and Raj Patel next to the scions of corporate architecture. And so it's just, quite a picture. And I don't know if those people will ever be in the same room again together. And to begin to kind of start wrapping us up, so I'll say about the sort of third category pretty quickly here, the sort of way we've thought about connecting design folks to policy folks through some of this built environment and climate change G&D research has been, it began with the Green New Deal for public housing communities that, again, Daniel and I and others worked on through Data for Progress, again, about a year and a half ago. Produced a whole series of reports. I won't make you read I won't go through all of these in any great detail. I'll just say they all kind of exist out there in the world. The way we approached this particular project has really informed a bunch of the work that's gone on since. And when I say the way we approached, what I mean by that is, basically public housing, beginning this process with public housing was the result of a few things. One was that it was put on the table by public housing residents themselves through something called People's Action Homes Guarantee. So this is, tenant organizers and other public housing residents who were themselves organized through People's Action, which is a big movement group spread across the U.S. And were successful in putting this on Representative-elect then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's radar. So they were able to convince her to make public housing kind of the first priority in the rollout of a Green New Deal, at least on the model legislation side. And for us, which for us was like fantastic. I'm a former public housing resident and was really eager to be able to do this work, but also meant we could, I think, build out a larger theory of change around taking assets that are publicly owned that by the government's own admission are highly distressed. So in the US, there was about 70 billion or so worth of retrofit work to be done just to clean out the lead, asbestos, and ventilation issues in most public housing units here. And so part of the argument for us in this process was to say, okay, to minimize disruption and to maximize, how far each dollar goes in public housing, what we should be doing is taking care of all of these really shameful backlogs of deferred maintenance while we do as much deep energy retrofit work in each unit as we can. So we're doing all of these things at once. We'll only spend about 1.3, 1.4 times what we would spend on just the cleanup, and we'll, all but zero out utility bills forever for these buildings. That bill is getting ready to get reintroduced, actually, with building and trades union support later this spring. And that has led now to this project within the center called the Community and Climate Project, or Climate Community Project, excuse me. It's getting ready to be spun off as its own kind of standalone nonprofit, and involves a bunch of our kind of, again, relatively junior friends on the left who are doing climate forward built environment research, connecting them with, movements whose demands maybe haven't yet made their way to Congress in the form of model legislation, and connecting them through some of the work we do to some of those legislators. So you can see here, some of the folks we've worked with and are working with, Congressman Jamal Bowman, Congressman Cori Bush, and Marie Newman, and of course others we could talk about in the Q&A. So now to the last part, which will be just a few minutes, and I promise we'll have time for discussion. To talk about the studios, so the place where some of this stuff has been kind of put into a pressure cooker, the way that studios tend to work. And so for me, being able to take the G&D into studios has, again, been a little luxurious. I got a 3-year commitment from Penn to teach these studios when I began, so built this kind of sequence purposefully as a 3-year sequence in which year 1, we'd move it from the national scale down to some regions. In year 2, we'd move from regions down to more site-specific work. And in year 3, we'd really have our set of sites and community partners to focus on our work with. And year 2, it just ended back in December. Year 3 is slated for the fall, although I think there's a chance it'll get pushed a little bit further. We'll just have to see how things go. But in that year 1, I asked, to get from national to regional level, I asked students to really focus on a couple of key questions. One being, what are the parts of the country you have to get right from a technical perspective to achieve the job justice and carbon goals of the Green New Deal? And from that more limited set of places, who would you put at the front of the line for investment, either because they're historically at the back of the line or because they offer you an opportunity to grow your political coalition, as well as by making the material benefits of a G&D more obvious. And they could have picked lots of places from, I think, those set of questions, but they chose 3, I think, pretty wisely. Appalachia, the lower Mississippi Delta, and the Corn Belt of the Midwest. And rather than asking them to try and solve a bunch of highly technical problems there, which, in all honesty, can't happen in any satisfying way in the scope of a studio, although people often try, ask them to focus instead on building out the kind of world again, that people do some world building exercises, thinking about how to communicate the things that a Green New Deal might offer in each of these places with a set of different partners. And so that included making some unfamiliar things like propaganda. So thinking about here, a cooperative food, social housing, and broadband program in Appalachia, producing some more familiar drawings. So in this case, showing the full build out of a clean energy system in Appalachia that's partnered with some timber production that's related to some of the social housing work that I mentioned. It's connected to, investments in leisure and recreation. And then some students, really focused in on the storytelling aspects, doing some basically zines or comics of pre and post Green New Deal investment in each of these communities. And rather than asking them to do the kind of typical, everyone pin up, do your final reviews the way you've always done them, ask them to put on a show, basically. So to curate an exhibition, to open it to the public, and then to program a few different things. So a gallery tour or sort of introductory tour from the curators, and then a series of panel discussions where they could, get beyond, say, the aesthetic or formal choices in their drawings and talk at a higher level about what all this work kind of meant. All of it lives here now. I won't make you watch this video, but I'm happy to drop a link to it after the chat. And so this has now become kind of the baseline for what's been called the Green New Deal Super Studio in the States. This is a partnership. You can see all of them kind of flittering across the screen there. I'll just say, we imagined probably getting 30 or 40 studios in the US to kind of focus on the Green New Deal through this vehicle over this academic year. We're pushing close to 200 now, which is great. It means we're going to have a ton of content and I think a ton of imagery and ideas to think about curating into some of the future exhibition and event work that we kind of have. We have kind of in our minds for this, but it also means now we have to look at a lot more work. And for me, so taking on studio number 2, so beginning back in those same three regions, it also meant focusing in on 3 specific industries: industrial agriculture, the fossil fuel system, and the prison industrial complex. And there are lots of reasons why those became sort of the focal points, the focal sectors or systems of studio number 2 for us. The most important is that last summer, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder here, some of the national organizing infrastructure for both the Green New Deal Network, which is kind of the national G&D organizing table, and the Movement for Black Lives, merge some of their operations or some of their coordinating efforts. And a result of that kind of merger was the foregrounding of these three industries as things that ought to be sort of immediately put on the table or organized around. So our studio was, again, for that reason and many others, focused on them as kind of the way our work unfolded. And just to give you a sense, the process we moved through, won't spend a ton of time on it. But again, thinking about these studios as ways to do kind of usable or productive speculation, which requires not trying to answer a bunch of relatively simple or reductive questions, but framing up the way we think about some of this work. And at least on my end, thinking about usable speculation is being distinct from nearly all other kinds of design fiction work, which tends to rely very heavily on Dunn and Raby, and it's come to mean that, at least in my case, these studios are dedicated to centering climate justice demands over, say, techno-utopian or eco-modernist demands. And so just to walk you through a little bit of a few of the products here, the students in here are building an atlas. So they're in my case, relying pretty heavily on Judy Shalansky's book, An Atlas of Remote Islands, and thinking about them as ideological arguments. And here, Shalansky is writing, didn't realize then that my atlas, like every other, was committed to an ideology. Its ideology was clear from its map of the world, carefully positioned on a double-page spread so that East and West Germany were on two separate pages. Geographical maps are abstract and concrete all at the same time. For all the objectivity of their measure, they cannot represent reality, only one interpretation of it. And so this is, again, this is the book. On the right, you get, beautiful cartographic islands, and on the left, you get what are often, quite dark dispatches from settlers' first encounters with those islands, where, they either led to heinous sort of genocidal acts, or if they did not encounter any indigenous peoples, often led to, cannibalism and all kinds of other things. And so wanted the students to think about how to hold those kind of two disparate things together as they built their atlas, producing, a set of beautiful drawings and images that were also sort of cutting political economic critiques or analyses of how and why those regions formed the way they formed. And won't spend a ton of time on them because I think, the stuff all lives actually now on a website that students have built, and I'll drop a link to that in a moment. But, the imagery itself is also, I think, just important for understanding how each of these places work, because I don't know how much time you've spent thinking about Appalachia. But one thing I'll say that came out of this work pretty clearly, right, is that Appalachia, among many other things, has begun to live, at least in some circles in the public imagination, as what's called a carceral archipelago, or one of the major places of incarceration in the United States. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is that one of the most common uses for abandoned mines in Appalachia now is the construction of detention facilities. And so there are lots of reasons for that. The most obvious being that there are massive federal and state financial incentives to build prisons on abandoned mines. There are actual grant programs called abandoned mine prison building programs, in which tens of millions of dollars are spent each year building these facilities that could be spent on literally anything else if we wanted to. The other is that these sites are already all cleared because they're strip mines, so they're flat and quite easy to build on. And the third, and maybe darkest, is that in order to build a prison on one of these sites in the U.S. or a detention facility, you don't have to do any of the same cleanup work you would do if you were building it for just about any other purpose. So this mass tranche of state and federal money, this existing site preparation work, and the lack of remediation or regulatory, requirements for building on the site all kind of coalesce to turn Appalachia's abandoned coal mines into some, very active and very large prison building complexes. And so, there are lots of ways that could be approached in the studio, and not to say this is kind of the only way, but one way we asked students to deal with this was to think through, what are the tools you might try to produce here that could, again, make themselves useful to some of the movement groups we have working with us in the studio. So in this case, a handful of different fence line, frontline, pipeline activist communities and establishments, movement leaders involved in some of the studio work. One of those ideas put forward by students was thinking through creation of a workbook. Here, this one's modeled on Mariam Akaba and Shira Hassan's Fumbling Towards Repair book, which is a restorative justice book for community organizing purposes. This one from A. McCullough is really looking at how do you democratize the design process, and how do you make this sort of all of the steps along the way from sort of conception to construction of a project ownable, runnable, administrable by anybody who lives in the region versus a sort of outside design firm who might be commissioned to do this work. And the Delta, they're obviously focused again on the fossil fuel system a bit, but also quite heavily on the commercial system for lots of reasons. One just being the sheer size and sort of power of them. So looking at Angola or the Louisiana State Pen in Louisiana itself, one of the largest prison sites in the world. I forget what the number is. It's something like 23, 24 times the size of Central Park. And again, working with a bunch of different groups there, thinking through how you might weave some of the storytelling work that's already underway in the Delta into some of the image building work that our
Thank you for taking the time.
Sorry, I'm not trying to avoid that. And so here, building a bunch of comics, zines, other things that, again, can begin building some of these stories into imagery we've produced that are aimed pretty squarely at building out the world that some of the movements in this part of the country have put forward and some of their demands. And I won't spend a ton of time on that. And I'll say lastly here, at the end, looking at the Midwestern group, one of the things they did was to produce a fictional podcast series or radio series kind of documenting the G&D rollout from 30, 40 years into the future. And so I'm going to play a version of that. I'm going to hope it's not too loud, but just prepare yourselves. I'm turning my volume down to try and spare you.
As I say every week, we're powered by the wind and powered by the people. I'm your host, Carrie Moss, and welcome to Breath of Air. This is Iowa People's Radio, for the people, by the people, and of the people. In this week's episode, we're continuing our series voicing 50 years of MARA, the Midwest Agricultural Regional Agency that worked to make the heartland flower through green jobs, education, and collective care. This series examines how artists have given voice, power, and representation to half a century of transformation in the lives of Midwesterners. Each interview threads public history into private stories, and it's in these intimate spaces of home we can understand the ways our world changed for the better. This week, before we speak to famed DJs of Detroit and Muscatine, we're going to trace back the systems that had to end to bring us into our shared future of plentitude.
And so the last thing I'll say, because I'm really looking forward to our combo, is just that, for anyone who wants to spend more time with this stuff, you're just not getting enough screen time, you feel like no one's making you look at your computer enough, or your phone or whatever, our students or my students have now built all of this out onto a sort of, total studio website. So dgnd.us, that'll take you through all the different, atlas or historical and contemporary analyses they've done. And then all of the speculative work as well on the kind of future side. So you can see some of that stuff beginning to emerge there. But with that, I will stop talking. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks for the lecture and for the kind of panorama that you have gave us about the Green New Deal over there. I think it's really a very relevant topic and something that, well, at least myself and the program I run at the Architectural Association, I was looking forward to look at a little bit in more detail of the type of work that you do, especially in the McGrath Center, but also with the students, and seeing the type of work that you produce with them, trying to change the formats, engage the students in a different type of dialogue, with the topics. Something that was interesting to me is the history of the U.S. New Deal. well, at least I know some bits, not all of it. No, you brought many details into the foreground. One of them was the kind of myth, no, that the U.S. New Deal was a top-down kind of thing. But again, you mentioned that it was more like a distribution of funds, and everybody was kind of working on that. And I was keen to ask you, like, in regards to the Green New Deal, because I had many people think that the Green New Deal is something that is already, cooked, no, or it's already something, or it's a plan that it's just, ready to be applied, and that we just need to kind of again distribute it. But perhaps similar to what happened over there, even though right now there's not the funds directly to the Green New Deal, it's something that it's on the build, no, not only in the imagination, but on the ideas, no, and perhaps that's what you are also exploring, no, with your studio, no, what exactly, I mean, based obviously on some of the ideas of the act, no, or the bill that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put in the House. Do you see your role, as a way to concretize, imagine how, what is the shape of that Green New Deal? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, I would say the kind of implicit in here, right, is this idea that HR 109, or at least the Green New Deal as it kind of currently lives in either the kind of policy or public imagination is incomplete. And that's correct. I think, HR 109 and any sort of ideation that's been done to date, I think it's always imagined one as kind of a framework. So not a piece of legislation that you would expect to pass, and like even if it did pass, would have no power. It's just a non-binding resolution. It's a way to basically say, here are our principles, here are our goals, and we want to spend the next 10, 20, 30 years building up a set of legislative and executive policy actions at the federal, state, and local level around them. And I think that's really important, because I think it's easy to look at HR 109 and say, well, it's missing X or Y, or it has too much of A or B, or it doesn't emphasize point C that I think is really important. And I think the authors of it, know that. That's why I think in the press conference introducing it, AOC herself said several times, we should view this as kind of a request for proposals. We know this isn't complete. We know this isn't where it needs to be. So help us get from where it is now to the actual finish line. And I think, related to that are kind of two big unanswered questions that, at least on my end, have become increasingly important. One of which is just like, how in the hell are we going to build the most stuff we've ever built, like in the history of the US, as fast and as well as we've ever built it, in ways that allow us to live up to our small d democratic values and allow self-determination both here and anywhere else around the world that is going to be involved in this build out. There's no way to do both of those things equally well. So thinking about how to answer those questions now on the back end becomes hugely important. The second is that, I think, so thinking about how to do all of that stuff well, is that how do we think about a Green New Deal that doesn't default back into just simply reformulating either, green capitalism or green imperialism around the world? And I think if you read HR 109, literally, it looks a lot like that. It's very techno, focused, very US kind of nationalistic in its focus, and cuts out most, if not all, of the rest of the world, which unfortunately is where, I think a lot of, at least Democrats in the US are today. This is why you see so much buy or build American stuff or jingoistic language in, US climate plans. I think HR 109 didn't lean into those, but it also didn't openly refute them. And I think that's an open question or problem that, Green New Dealers are going to have to think about. And this is where I think people like Thea Riofrancos, Olufemi Taiwo, others who've worked in this space have really begun to lay out, I think, what a path forward looks like for an internationalist Green New Deal. And they're both involved in a bunch of work we do in the center among all the other things they do in their lives, and have been hugely important, I think, for the way I've thought about some of those questions.
Thanks. That seems to start to address some of the comments in the chat. No, that there's quite a lot of worry that a Green New Deal can be, as you mentioned, no, a form of imperialism. We had a lecture last week, no, from Jane Hutton, no? That you know, and there's this issue about the reciprocal landscapes, and the stories that she lay out is all about you know, how by you know, producing certain things, objects, buildings, etc. Sometimes we don't see the hidden backgrounds, no, that are producing, you know, exploitation. Well, in the case of the Green New Deal, a lot of the comments that are placed by Saga are like, you know, the green renewables will, you know, we produce the same extractivism, no, that we are seeing from the fossil fuel, no, and I guess, I mean, that's the reason why the internationalist part of the Green New Deal is important to lay out. But what would you say about that? Those worries of that the Green New Deal is just a different form of imperialism, just kind of coated with green mantra.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that's a worry I share and have for, I think, as long as I've done this work. This is, you know, I think the first question, one of the first questions that were asked in kind of the early rooms, early discussions around the Green New Deal back in, I don't know, 2017 or 2018, and the answer that often sort of unsatisfyingly comes from folks I know in that world when that question gets asked is like, we're not sure what to do, but someone else is working on it. And I think actually the answer is that no one really is thinking all that concretely about this question. And it certainly isn't going to come, like the answers to this question aren't going to come from the US or the West or the Global North. I don't know, like, I don't know what the right answer to this is. It's incredibly hard. I think this is where, you know, Dana LaDonna Cohen's essay, which is now like 5 or 6 years old, called The Last Stimulus, becomes important to think about. Some of it gets wrapped up into their book, Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, but it's thinking through, you know, thinking about the energy transition and all of the associated work that comes with it as the last, maybe the last sort of major infrastructure building effort that we ever undertake. And how do we do that as well as we can, knowing we can't do it perfectly, and try to set ourselves up to never have to do anything like it again. Again, I don't think all these answers are going to come from me. I wish that I held that much power like in Green New Deal world, but unfortunately do not. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's about as far as I can go with that.
Thanks. I'm gonna check whether if there are questions from the public. Just remember that if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the function, or you can also send us a question via the chat. I have a
there's a question in the chat from Alan.
okay.
It says, if one of the questions is how can design professionals play a lead role in the Green New Deal despite the capitalist neoliberal economic models that largely support the design professions, wouldn't part of the answer be reviving and bolstering the design center movement? Design centers operate with a different economic model and are deeply connected to the stakeholders and aspirations of the communities in which they work. Bolstering the design center ecosystem could also affect the way design professionals are changed, because if more students spent some time working for a design center instead of jumping right from school to a firm, they would get more exposure to the real needs and aspirations of real communities and perhaps take that sensibility along with them to a firm.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is yes, I would assume so. I think part of, you know, thinking again about the context that the New Deal emerged in here becomes kind of important because, you know, if you think back to that kind of org chart of where landscape architects worked in the US during the New Deal and it being, you know, I don't know, like 20 or so kind of agencies, one of the reasons for that is, you know, the Great Depression at the time, bringing forward kind of a very rapid and profound kind of firm consolidation. So as firms were failing in the context of the Great Depression, a few mega firms were emerging and most everyone else was being, you know, employed directly through the federal government in the design services world or the design industry. And so this was a moment of kind of unmatched and sort of massive influx of design and architects, landscape architects into public service in the federal government. So I think, you know, to answer this question, I think, yeah, we're probably going to need more, we're probably going to have to think about alternatives to the private firm model. And we need lots and lots and lots of those. And so one of those might be design centers, one of those might be more direct federal or national employment. And then I'm sure there are other ideas, that I haven't sort of crossed my mind. But I think the short answer to this is yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Perhaps some issue with that is in your essay of the designing with the Green New Deal, there's obviously the issue of working with the public sector, no? That could also be an alternative, no, to that one. Here in the UK, at least in from the 50s to the 70s, there was at least half of the architects were working in the public sector. And right now it's like, I don't know, less than 5% of them working on them. And obviously the profession is, is purely a service provider, no, for that point, no? So I guess also the reinforcement or the idea of creating practices within the public sector can actually be a way forward, I guess, no? Is that something that you see happening over there? Or how do you see that? Is it something that you foresee in the future? Is it something that perhaps you get some hopes from the students you have? How do you see that part?
Yeah, I mean, on the student side, I think these are the kinds of things that every student who comes in our door, and I think most stores, I'm sure this is true for you too, are really hungry for alternatives to the kind of extractive or exploitative model that, is required to private firms. And I think, thinking about it requires us to do a couple of things. So to think about firms like as just part of the professional services industry, I think helps to clarify a bunch of questions about how they operate. So if you think about, a design firm as being, materially indistinct from a McKinsey & Co., I think it helps us think about how they might, justify internally and have it make sense to them working on climate forward resilience or justice projects as they're also building a bunch of detention facilities around the world. I think when we think about an AECOM and HOK, some of the big mega firms who are involved in building some of the most immiserative landscape architectural projects in the world, as they also build maybe some of the most, innovative climate forward projects in the world. It's easier to understand some of the why or how questions when we think about it in this political economic way and thinking about them as materially indistinct from any other professional services firm operates around the world, like McKinsey, like Rand, like some of the others. And so I think, on our student side, that means that most of them don't want to do that work, and I don't blame them because I don't want to do it either. That's why I sit where I sit. And so at least in our context here, there aren't a lot of great pathways into other kinds of ways of practicing architecture or landscape architecture, especially things like capital A or capital L architecture, landscape architecture. And so for us, that means trying to build some of those kind of on-ramps or off-ramps here while they're in school. And there are a couple different fellowship programs that, at least in the US, allow them to make the jump pretty seamlessly from grad school to federal service. And I have a few students now who are doing this, one of whom is working in the Senate for Senator Jeff Merkley and is going to be involved in basically every big infrastructure or public works bill that comes out of the Senate over the next couple of years. Not something most landscape architects get asked to do here, so it's pretty exciting. The other is that a bunch of our students are, I think, really interested in doing things that probably won't be viewed as landscape architecture or architecture by, our professional organizations. And I think that's the other thing. I mean, this is part of how I wound up where I wound up, is that I just did a bunch of things that don't count as landscape architecture. And it turns out that those were things that I guess were important to landscape architecture 10 years later. But I have some students who need, we have a bunch of students who both need to and in fact are, I think, going to be okay with, doing things that aren't sanctioned landscape architecture for a long time. And thinking about how to take the skills you pull out of a studio-based education like ours and apply them in all kinds of other settings that are, operating either outside of or in opposition to market forces and capitalism.
Okay, thanks, Billy. Well, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to perhaps say a little bit more about the Green New Deal. There's a possibility, the super studio. I mean, you mentioned that obviously at the end of the presentation. There's a possibility that perhaps we can do something similar over here, and because this might be, I guess, a way of addressing also the issue of internationalism, like as well of, how to include other ideas, how to share knowledge, how to perhaps, try those formats that you've been testing with your students. But how do you see that at a global or international level happening, and how do you think it might inform the Green New Deal moving forward?
Could you say that one more time? You cut out a little bit there towards the end for me.
Yeah, just how do you see that? A potential, because the issue of the super studio, no? Because there's, I put it in another way, like there's a kind of current culture within academia, no? That is a lot about competition, no? Like you have different studios that, one tries to, beat the other one, no? And as I understand, the Green New Deal Super Studio over there is a form of collaboration, no? Of knowledge creation, and perhaps also addressing many of the issues that the fact of internationalism is kind of bringing forward. No? So I was mentioning also the possibility that could happen over here in the UK, no? And that could also be, a way of, collaborating, or a way of, creating some form of solidarity rather than competition. No? So just wanted you to expand on that point of view of competition, but against solidarity, and perhaps, how that might be a way within the academia to also inform the evolution of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, this is a great point, I think, for us to chat about. One is just, I think you're exactly right. The Super Studio was always kind of imagined here as like a vehicle for more collaboration and more cooperation. There's always a tendency in academia, I think, for people to feel like they own things for lots of reasons that are silly and like avoidable. And knowing that going in, knowing it was silly and avoidable, wanted to avoid that with this potential issue. I think it would have been easy 2 or 3 years ago to just, for me or for Penn, to just say like, well, we've done G&D stuff already, so this is like our thing, stay away. Which is, I think, what could have happened. But I think, to everyone's credit involved, including my chair, Richard Weller, and then all the folks at LAF, CELA, all the other ASLA, all the other partners involved. I think everyone was just ready to say, like, this is way too big a topic for any 1 or 2 or 3 of us to take on. We're not going to be able to like think through any of the answers or questions all on our own. So why don't we put this to as many people as possible and start thinking about having a collective conversation about the kind of world that, the Green New Deal might build, and the kind of massive social and economic and political restructuring it would require. And to do that through studios for a year and kind of see where we land. And I think, that process, it's still ongoing, but so far has been just incredibly generative and exciting. I think, I'm personally like extremely excited about the prospect of that extending, across the pond over to y'all, and to see what you can do with it here, and maybe across the rest of England or the UK, or into Europe, or around the rest of the world. And I think allows us, the longer some of these sort of collective or collaborative models, take hold, and some of them I'm sure will outlive the Super Studio. In conversation with a few folks about post Super Studio projects that are drawing on the Super Studio already. I think it'll allow us to take some of these, bigger questions about, say, international relations or political economy of the energy transition into account in ways that, again, you can't do in a 12 or 15-week studio very well. Studios are good at either initiating or ending a research process. And so I think in some ways they've been really good about getting us started and allowing us to kind of, move forward.
Perfect. I'm not sure if there are more comments on or questions. I think we have addressed some of the worries in the chat and some of the questions. I don't know if you have any last comment, but for me, I think this is a kind of great opportunity, for the profession to get involved, and also to through the skills that we have, through the skills that we have acquired, or that we are acquiring if we are students, to address some of the things that we might be interested, but also the issues. I mean, in a similar way, like what you've done in the Appalachia, for example, addressing issues about incarceration, social injustice, etc. That the studio and the profession could actually, start thinking about that, reflecting about that, and working alongside, disciplines that are addressing those aspects. So yeah, I think with that, perhaps we just end here, because it was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for your time. And we're going to share with you all the questions and comments that people sent through the chat.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and we hope that the conversation continues and interaction through a potential super studio in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.